Hello and welcome to the Third Sector Podcast. I'm Andy Ricketts.
And I'm Emily Harle. Each week we bring you half an hour of discussion and debate about the important goings-on in the charity world. This week we'll be finding out how one charity has refreshed its brand for the digital age.
And that charity is the Great Ormond Street Hospital charity, commonly known as GOSH, which is this month launching a new brand campaign after refreshing its decades-old brand last year. The rebrand process, which began in 2022, is the first update to the charity's brand since 2017. And to talk us through the process, we're delighted to be joined in the studio by Emma Guise, the charity's Marketing and Communications Director. Hello, Emma. Thanks for joining us.
Hello there. Thank you very much for having me.
Now, could you tell us about GOSH's new brand? What's changed and why did you consider it necessary?
Yeah, of course. Well, the reason we really wanted to do it, you touched on it first, Andy, that we hadn't looked at our brand since 2017. And the big challenge we were facing is we have a huge, ambitious strategy as an organisation. We need to raise a lot more money over the next few years to do the groundbreaking work that we do, things like the new cancer centre that we're looking to build that's going to be world leading. The fact that we're the UK's biggest charitable funder of childhood research. These are really incredible seismic things that we're trying to fund. But like I say, our brand hadn't been refreshed for about 7 to 10 years. And the challenge that we had as a brand is we're very famous. Most people have heard of Great Ormond Street Hospital charity. We have fame. But we're not necessarily relevant to people. That fame and that brand love, people tended to really love us as a brand, but it wasn't translating and it isn't translating into the level of fundraising and engagement that we want and we need to do that transformational work that I talked about. So we undertook a process to understand what was going on there. Why weren't we translating into that with our audiences? It was really clear to us that we needed to show up in a new way to our audiences, to our brand, and connect with them and make ourselves what we would call relevant, right? So relevancy is really important. There's two things we're trying to do with our brand now. We're trying to grow our awareness. So we're trying to be seen more, and that's partly why we're doing brand campaigns now, which I'm sure we'll come on to later. But we're trying to be more relevant. We're trying to connect. Great Ormond Street Hospital charity, it's, like I say, people loved us. They were passionate about us. We're a bit like Marks and Spencer's. You want to know we're there on your high street. But for most people, unless you have a seriously ill child, we're probably not relevant to your life, right? We're probably not like cancer charities. You tend to know somebody affected by cancer, you're relevant. We wanted to think about how could we make ourselves more relevant and connect into people's lives. And so that's why we did this piece of work and sort of repositioned ourselves in a few ways. First of all, the focus on childhood. When we really looked at everything that we did as an organisation, whether it's keeping families together through our accommodation or the play team or the research, it's really about protecting every element of a childhood's life. So many of the children in the hospital spend their childhoods in hospital, and we think that's an injustice. Nobody wants to think of their children in that place. So the first thing we did, how could we connect and tell the story of how we protect childhood? Because childhood is a universal experience that we've all had. Then how can we tell the story that it's not just about protecting the childhoods? We're trying to make progress. We're trying to change and really drive a transformation for those childhoods. Like I say, whether that's through research, through new medical equipment, whatever it might be, we need to show up in a way that brings hope, but a sense of progression, that the public could join us and be part of that change. So that was the real reason why we did it. And because the insight of when we started that strategy process told us that the audiences we needed to target, the audiences where we had the biggest potential to bring them in, to grow our income, they wanted that sense of progression and they wanted a sense of collectivism. They wanted to be part of something as a collective. And so we used that kind of platform of childhood, really brought that through in our storytelling and showed how we were driving progress through our brand. When we launched last summer, that was really the new articulation of who we are, what we deliver in the world as an organisation.
And how do you navigate being that known brand? People do know of Gosh Charity and they do recognise the branding. How do you navigate maintaining that knowledge and that reputation while also embarking on a new brand strategy and a new look and identity?
It's a really good question and it's not easy. One of the things we did when we started this process was do a piece of research to really understand what was our current, what we call brand equity. What I mean by that is what are the things about our brand that are most well known, that work hardest for us as a brand. And we made sure that we kept those. So things like the logo, for example, and I don't want your audience to think that when I talk about brand, I'm only talking about colours and logos. However, some of those things are important, right? So we did some research and we understood that our logo and our name really are huge brand equity. They're ubiquitous, really. But actually, things like our colour, I don't know if you remember, we used to be a more kind of regal purple. Nobody associated us with that. They associated us actually with blue. Makes sense, NHS, you know. So we really took the time to understand what are the treasured bits of our brand equity, other things about the role that we play, how we talk about ourselves. We made sure we understood what they were. We fed those into the strategy process, but then built on those to make sure that we were showing up and telling the story that perhaps we hadn't told until now. So before, we used to talk about ourselves far more in, we do accommodation, we do research. We sort of told these individual elements of our work in the context of the hospital. Now we told the story as this is a collectively what we do to protect childhoods. And we're doing it to make progress for childhoods in the future so we can save more. So it was really saving what was really important, making sure you understand what that is, doing that research, but then building on that to reshape you and tell your story that's relevant for an audience today.
And what does the rebrand mean in terms of your approach to digital?
Well, digital was one of the most important considerations we had at the very start of the process. I said before, we hadn't rebranded since 2017. 2017 was a very different time in terms of how we were even consuming digital and the way digital was shaping everything. So our brand was very static. We had nothing that moved, that animated, that showed up on a digital platform in the way that so many brands now do. Even perhaps the way that we talked about ourselves, the language we were using. I mean, if you think about how we all consume digital, we are scrolling through reams and reams of content trying to grab our attention. Our attention needs to be grabbed through really simple devices like colour, imagery, tone of voice, language, and motion and graphic. Our old brand just simply didn't speak to that. At the heart of this brand refresh, when we undertook it, as well as trying to set the brief of shift us into that childhood space, make us feel like we're progressive and we're a collective, the other areas were digitally enhance us, make us move, make us come alive, make us more accessible. Changes in accessibility over the last sort of 10 years have also been seismic. So how is our brand accessible? And make us distinctive. Distinctiveness is a really important thing, especially in a digital space. How are you getting cut through against everything else that's out there? So those things were baked in. And what it meant was we developed things like new motion graphics. So we were all shifting now towards more content that's film and motion led, animation. We now have a set of guidelines that our teams can use producing any kind of content, whether it's on Instagram right through to what we're doing right now, which is some beautiful digital out of home assets that you'll hopefully see on a tube station on your journey home. Making sure that always looks consistent through these graphics, these guidelines, in a way that we just simply didn't have before. People often, I think about digital and think about it in terms of we should be doing digital marketing. We should be investing in digital marketing. Well, that's great. What if your content isn't as digitally enabled to be on those platforms? You're potentially spending money that isn't showing up in the best possible way for your brand. So it's not just about where you put your brand, it's how your brand shows up in those spaces.
And when you're putting together those guidelines, there's a line you've got to walk with, making sure it's cohesive, but then also making sure it works across all those different platforms.
Absolutely.
How did you navigate that?
A really interesting question. And I think one of the key things we had to think about there, of course, is user-generated content. We're very lucky, right? The place that we support is a physical place we can go to. In many ways, lots of other charities don't have that. You don't have the tangibility of the place that you're helping that you can just go into. So we get tons of extraordinary user-generated content, children ringing the bell at the end of their cancer treatment, unique moments of care, of surgeons working, with the most extraordinary technology to change their lives. These guidelines, the motion guidelines, allow us to take all of that, but give it a sense of brand identity alongside perhaps our more specially produced content. Everything can look the same. And so when we went through the process, we had to stress test it across all of those assets and make sure that it worked. Well, one thing I'd say is, like with any new brand that you do, you'll be stress testing it once it's out live in market, right? It won't stop once you go live. In many ways, it's your biggest learning curve. But yeah, we really had to bake that in again into the process when we were developing those guidelines.
If I just take you back to the beginning of the process as well, obviously for any charity, their brand is one of their most important things. So when you start fiddling with that can seem a bit scary. What considerations did you have at that point in terms of, well, is this the right time to do it? Is now when we should be looking to rebrand? What were the things you were thinking about?
Yeah, there was a lot we were thinking about, and you're absolutely right. The main thing that was drawing me to say we had to look at the brand was the size of the ambition I talked about. Like I say, we're needing to raise 300 million for the Children's Cancer Centre. We've still got half of that to raise, by the way. It's a long journey. The level of ambition of what we needed to invest in is huge. And as I say, a lot of our brand was feeling, it was of its time, and we weren't showing up in a way that was relevant to newer audiences. Audiences, of course, are changing all the time, right? Younger generations are getting older, and they're coming with their younger generation expectations and behaviours that I think we just weren't, our old brand just wasn't reflecting and responding to. I suppose it's a bit like a lot of big life decisions. You'll never find the right time, right? There's never a perfect time. I felt personally that we simply were not telling the amazingness of the story of that hospital in the way that the brand was showing up. It was a massive missed opportunity. One of the big considerations when you're embarking on a project like this is your senior leadership buy-in and your trustee buy-in. That was huge. But I just brought it back to the ambitions of the organisation and the strategy and said, as your leader of marketing communications, the only way I can get you to where you want to be is if we make sure we have a brand that tells the story in the most powerful way that it can. And this is how we can do that. But I think you have to be held by your insight. One of the key stats I kept going to was that when we looked at our audiences, 60% of people said that they loved us, were passionate about us, but only 10% were donating to us. So there was a massive disconnect between people that were feeling the love, who had an awareness, had a sense of us, but it wasn't translating into donations. We know we need to grow our income to do the ambitious things that we need to do. So we need to shift the way that we're telling our story.
You mentioned there as well the board and involving them. How do you go about kind of navigating that? How involved are trustees in these kind of processes from your point of view?
Yeah.
And what are your kind of tips for other charities that are going through that process?
My one reflection, I would say, particularly about Great Ormond Street Hospital Charity, is our board of trustees are hugely engaged and were from the outset as a board. I've worked in a few charities now, and levels of engagement with trustees can vary. Gosh charities are passionately engaged. I'm sure lots of other charities will have this system. You have your main board of trustees, and then you have subcommittees, and your subcommittees tend to speak to certain different parts of your business. So you'll have a finance and audit committee, perhaps the committee that looks at your service delivery. We have something called GRR, which is our Governance, Risk and Reputation Committee, and they're a subcommittee of trustees that look at everything related to our brand and our fundraising. I made sure I brought that subcommittee along the journey at every single stage. So they were aware at brief stage, when we did the strategy in-depth work, they were there. I brought them along every bit of sort of step of that journey. I would either do one-to-ones with them, group sessions, and I made sure that they understood the rationale they brought in. And I think it was a huge amount of time and investment. There could be arguments that that's a lot to ask of your trustees, actually, and you need a group of people that are willing to give you that time. But what I would say was Then every time I went into the main board of trustees, and I was only giving them very key moments, and I needed them to sign off my direction of travel, I had an engaged and supported subgroup in that room who could vouch, who could endorse, who understood, and it allowed me to get through those milestones of sign off each time. They're also passionate advocates of your brand. They actually really know your organisation well. They added a huge amount of value. The biggest tip I would give people, though, with your trustees is you need to really set the boundaries of what you're asking them. So the thing I would go into every board meeting and say is, I'm not asking whether you like this. Please don't wordsmith it. We're not here to pick apart the minutiae. Tell me if it meets the brief, and tell me if, therefore, you support the direction of travel. But please don't tell me what you sort of do and don't like, because that's not what this is about. And I know that's hard, but you have to do that. You have to tell them what their job is in that space, and very clearly tell them with a smile on your face and very politely. But I was very clear. I couldn't take a board of trustees in minutiae wordsmith on my new brand. Do you support where we're going? And remember, this is for this audience, not for you. Let's remember that. Let's anchor ourselves in the brief and what we're here for.
So in terms of setting the budget for the rebrand, which also requires all that sign off, the charity spent around £150,000 on the rebrand process. How do you go about determining what budget to set?
I mean, we started the process building what we needed to do in stages, right? So there was the strategy stage, and then turning the strategy into what might the new brand look like, and then how might we take that out. And we set individual budgets for each of those stages. And you partly set that by what is your charity and organisation willing to spend. And I say this because I imagine there's a lot of small charities out there listening and thinking, you know, we can't afford to do big pieces of work like that. And then looking at what agencies, freelancers, specialist consultants might charge. You know, you do a bit of assessment of costs, etc. And I think the important thing to say is, you know, there is a way of doing this that every organisation could afford. One of the things I'd say that most of that 150,000 actually went on was testing. We made sure we tested, particularly with families who had been affected by serious illness, either current families in the hospital or previous ones. We tested about 3 big stages. At each stage, we did a testing process, and we wanted to make sure that that was done really thoroughly. As well as making sure it resonated with our new audiences, we couldn't lose that, almost that point from your original question. How do you make sure you don't lose the heart of who you are as an organisation with the people you support and you exist for every day? So actually, a lot of that budget was spent on the testing. But like I say, I think there are ways, you know, you can embark on this project. Remember, you're not spending 150,000 every year. This was once a 7 to 10 year piece of work. That was a very tiny proportion of our overall income, and I would argue cuts across everything we do as an organisation and how we show up, and will make us more relevant and impactful long term, hopefully for the next 10 years. So it's really about making the case of long term investment and why it matters.
And in terms of measuring the success, so you've mentioned stress testing as you go. How do you do that while also measuring the success and make those changes and adapt as you continue to roll out the refresh?
There's no denying on measurement and KPIs and testing. It's hard because this is a long-term piece of work you're doing. You won't see immediate results that you can take back to your trustees. So going back to your trustee engagement, the other thing you're going to be telling them regularly, as well as don't wordsmith for me, is please buy into this as a long-term piece of work. Please know you won't get immediate results. We set measures around our awareness and our what we call consideration to donate, and something called buzz. So essentially hearing about us, a sense of activity around you as a brand. Those measures take years often to shift, even small percentages, especially if you don't have huge amounts of investment. You know, we're not the big charity brands who have a good few million to do brand building each year. We're nowhere near that. So those were the kind of long-term measures we're setting. Although what you can do is do in-moment tracking of those. So when we have a brand burst, like we have at the moment and like we had in June, we can track actual shifts, especially in our audiences. So remember, I've said we're really thinking about some specific audiences now. We can break down those measures by those audiences and see the shifts that we're making. So I can take that back. But often you do have to look at more intangible measures like feedback, like stakeholder input, and also perhaps in product impact as well. So we're starting to turn all of our fundraising products now into the new brand. That takes time. Remember, we've got a brilliant team of designers and in-house creatives, but they're learning how to apply this new creative. You're learning on the job really as you take it through. So we're constantly getting intel about new assets created, performance on those. We're using in data to think about how that might apply to things that are coming up and we're changing. But the big message I would say is you are going to have patience, and your organization is going to have patience. And you might do things wrong. There might be an application of the brand you do that isn't the best that it was, and you'll learn from that and do better next time. But you will have to ask people to sort of hold their nerve and be patient with you.
Just picking up on that subject of the things that you've learned, what's gone particularly well, would you say, in the process so far?
I think where we've landed with our new brand, the refresh, how we're showing up, the point I made about the digital first, the accessibility, the distinctiveness, the way we're able to tell our story now. The exemplar of that is the campaigns that we're now taking out. So the one we did in June, we've got one live in market today. We're really starting to, I think, find a confidence, a clarity of storytelling that we didn't have. We're really taking that digital first step. If I think about, again, the campaign we've got in market right now, it's all digital. So we're using digital out of home, YouTube, and we're taking that format, and it's actually the perfect format for the way we want to tell our story, which is all about those sort of precious childhood moments. I think when we all think about our childhood, you reflect on it as sort of little moments that happen to you, those little kind of special moments in your life that really mattered to you, that was with family, with friends. We're now finding a way to really take those moments and play that back to our audiences and use digital formats for that. One of the things that we did was take a lot of our stakeholders through the journey, things like corporate partners, some of our high value, and we're really starting to find a confidence as well, again, in terms of how we're working with them, with the new brand. We have, for example, a really fantastic annual event called Race for the Kids that we do with an organisation called RBC. And because we've got this sort of new playful element to the brand, I haven't talked so much about that today, but one of the things we have with the brand is this sort of stretch of tonality. So we can do quite harsh realities. And then we have these wonderful animal characters that we were given that are inspired by the names of the ward in the hospital. All children's wards at the hospital are named after animals. And so the designer took that as inspiration, and we now have these wonderful animal characters that move. They're our kind of doers, that sense of progression again. And we're starting to play with that and use that across, a more fun product like Race for the Kids. So it's really wonderful to see now how the team is growing in confidence in terms of how it can use it, how we can now bring it to partners and stakeholders in a way that we couldn't before. So I think that's where I'm really seeing great success with the brand.
And then just on the flip side of that, then, what are the sort of challenges and maybe things that you would have done differently in hindsight?
Yes, yeah. And of course, there's so much you learn. And if I go back to the kind of process and some of the things I would have done differently, the thing I'd like to emphasize is a rebrand or a refresh. I mean, we didn't change our brand. We refreshed it. We brought a new energy to it. But it's a big process. I talked about those stages. You start with your audiences, you start with your insight, and then you develop a strategy and about who you are and how you want to show up and what you need to shift. And then you take that and you need to start thinking about, okay, what do we need to change about our brand assets, whether that's our design, our tone of voice, but also the kind of fundamentals of how we are as an experience, right through to then how we take ourselves out to market. And the thing I would say is that's huge and it's a big process. and make sure that you work with the right people at those stages, if that makes sense, and take each stage as a stage. Relook at it, reset your targets and what you're looking to achieve, and then go out and speak to people and speak to agencies and consultants and creatives, and make sure you've got the very best and right people working with you at each stage. And that's a really huge learning, I would say. Time. I mean, you have no idea how long these things can take. And especially if you want to do it well, you want to bring all of those stakeholders with you. You want to do all of that brilliant testing I talk about. Plan your time and then add 6 months to it as a minimum is what I would say. And then finally, the other big learning I had, make sure you really go into the depth of conversation with your stakeholders. Brand refreshes will probably take you a minimum a year, if not 18 to 2 years, because you have got to do it well. You've got to do in-depth interviews, etc. There is a risk a little bit with almost kind of people possibly changing their mind through that process. Do you know what I mean? Starting to see the world differently, things happening differently. And there is a risk that you can start to unpick the process and strategy you got to. So be prepared for some challenging conversations and be prepared to hold people to account for what they said and what they were thinking. It won't be easy, and people possibly don't even realise they might shift what they're saying or how they're directing. And you've got to, as the leader to all marketing and communications directors out there, you'll be the person holding this together, right? You're going to be the one holding everyone to account, making sure it stays and it isn't unravelled, as it were. And that can be hard, and you'll have to have some tough conversations at times.
And final question, you touched on it a little bit earlier in terms of the length of time it can take to do a rebrand. But what would be your top tips for other charities that are thinking about going through this kind of a process?
Yes, so lots of top tips. And of course, happy to talk to anyone out there about to embark on this process. And one thing I'd really reflect on is use your contacts. I'm really passionate about the third sector and charities. It's the only sector I've ever worked in. And I think we're really connected as a sector. We all know each other. And one thing I'd really recommend is you pull on your contacts, talk to people who have been through this experience. But in terms of really key things, time absolutely is one of them. You will need lots and lots of time. But the other thing I'd say is you also can't let it drag on too long because you lose momentum, if that makes sense. So it is that fine line between giving yourself the time and not letting it feel like a project that never ends and people sort of lose enthusiasm for. The thing I'd say is be really clear on your why. What is your insight behind why you need to rebrand? I think I talked a lot about what was driving for us at Great Ormond Street Hospital Charity. So be very clear on what your why is and make sure that anchors you throughout the process. The other thing I would say is you cannot engage enough with stakeholders, with your staff. You cannot tell people enough why you need to do this and bake in that time for communicating, for engaging, for bringing people along the journey. And then the final thing I would champion is testing. I talked about how we did testing every key stage, particularly with families and patients at the hospital, particularly with the audiences that we were focused on to shift our brand understanding. But even once you're out in market, once you launch your brand, just see that as another testing phase. You're taking it out now into the wild, as we call it, and you're going to be learning. There's no way anybody could design for you a brand that is so perfectly refined that it is going to meet every reality of how your brand goes out to your market and to your audiences. So recognize that even once it's out there, that's just another stage of your testing and refining. Be okay with that. Learn, adapt, set in place things that will capture what you need to know about your intelligence, etc. The other final thing I'd say as well, because I'm really conscious that perhaps there will be organisations out there who think, I'm a lot smaller than you, we simply don't have the resources to do that. The key things I'd say on that is, when we launched the brand, we really made sure we integrated. So from that moment in June, everything that was going out, we made sure integrated and sang to and haloed to the new brand. Anybody can do that. Make sure there's a consistency in what you're doing. Beg, steal and borrow advertising space. There was an example where I got an email through for a particular advertising spot. and they were offering a discount, but it was still way out of my budget. I would never be able to buy that spot, but I thought it could be lovely. I thought we could do some great brand storytelling around it. So I replied and said, is there anything you can do? I'm from this charity. Would you help me? And the person on the receiving end of that, their uncle had been helped by Great Ormond Street Hospital Charity and said, leave it with me. I just think there's no harm in asking. And you'll be surprised what people will come back with. So go out, use your contacts, ask. You'll be surprised what you can get for very little.
I think that's a great place for us to leave it. Emma Guise from Gosh Charity, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you.
Well, we hope you enjoyed our discussion with Emma, and that's it for this week. Next time, we'll be learning about the importance of co-creation in charity programming. We'll find out how one charity has managed to meaningfully embed a process of co-creation with its service users into its culture and strategy. From all of us here at Third Sector, thank you for listening. Our producer is Till Owen.